Okay, in this lesson for our Koine Project Class, of course, you notice I'm wearing a Cherokee Nation t-shirt, which actually doesn't reflect the actual nation. This was a reference to what had come to be known in Oklahoma, where the concentration camps were established. There's a trail of tears, if you will. I've said before, my grandmother was born on one of those in Oklahoma. And in 2009, the multicultural textbook that was part of the curriculum for a teacher pursuing a degree in education certification by the state of Arkansas, it was called a concentration camp. So I did research years ago, and I was somewhat of an activist, and I was fascinated to learn that Baptists walked on the Trail of Tears, and I found in their history a trail of blood. Now, of course, their history, like all things, is now evaluated from the perspective in retrospect with all of our data. And of course, we can click through a computer search and know more in just a few weeks than people could have acquired. But the Trail of Blood was the attempt to have a record of martyrs throughout history. And we'll see that advocacy for the separation of church and state, primarily state-established church and religion, that would then impose its morals and dogma upon a free citizenship. And we'll read about that. But this lesson, I found my piece of paper. I had a title all worked out, but I could hardly see it, and I forgot about it. So it's Anabaptist, plural. Ana is the prefix that goes back to ancient times when state-established religion would accuse people of rebaptizing someone. And if you read the history, like even in our culture today, in this civil society, the United States of America, for example, you'll notice that few people teach baptism is an exodus, like the book of Exodus. The entire book was about their way out, EX, out from Odos way. You'll notice in the New Testament, Paul referenced they were all baptized into Moses. Excellent lesson. The first word in church, not the English word, but the term ecclesia, from which that English word has been used, not as we would say precisely, and certainly not preferred by Baptists, of course, today. But the first word in ecclesia is out from. So these people severed their ties from state-established religion, theistic orders, whatever they might be, certainly in the effort to live in a nation as we have today. One of the inalienable rights, the right to peaceably assemble, which is our understanding of ecclesia, we assemble, and that's our primary means of worshiping God in spirit and in truth, and we do so freely with a freedom of conscience, and we worship God directly through Jesus Christ alone, whom we acknowledge as our head. Now, you can see the historical implications that if we didn't recognize a hierarchy in a state-established religion, but recognize Christ alone, that would be a problem for tyrannical kings. So the first word, Anabaptist, plural, possessive, Anabaptist, acquaintance with antagonist, or antagonistic, polytheist, plural, and atheist today, which seems to be a result of a civil society where open debate, freedom of speech, conscience, and thought, which has always been advocated by Baptists. So from Trajan's Contagion to Dawkins Delusion, and there's no reprisals to be feared. And I've been watching something called Oxford Union Society, where they call in experts from all over, and people are members of that society, I suppose, who are graduates there or somehow affiliated, and they speak, and it's quite remarkable to see the freedom, the dialogue. We've always encouraged that. So I'll reference Trajan for a moment. This was a course that I took at University of Arkansas, Little Rock, and I had discovered the seminary, the oldest Bible school in the state of Arkansas, by asking in the university system in Arkansas, where can you go to learn Bible language? Because regardless of what class you're in, someone will reference a Greek word or a Hebrew word. And of course, that's when I learned of the seminary before I was ever actually in a church that Baptists historically would acknowledge as one of the New Testament churches with any credential. So I pursued that. and was there actually for 1 year, the first year I attempted, before I'd ever even been a member of one of their churches. So it was quite a fascinating thing to find the oldest Bible school in the state of Arkansas, accredited by all state universities, and all hours can transfer. And that was fascinating. And in it, you study history, a lot of Baptist history. And Pliny, I call him Pliny, he was a governor in the Roman province. And I say Pliny because it rhymes with whiny. And it's funny, in looking back, he spoke to Trajan, and he said, the contagion of this superstition has spread not only in the cities, but in the villages and rural districts as well. Yet it seems capable of being checked and set right. Earlier, he had mentioned that people had stopped the attendance at the polytheistic, let's say, where people would go into their temples and have their worship. And of course, there was an economy there, silversmiths who made the trinkets, the idols. And of course, you remember emperors would deify themselves. So I would say it wasn't delusional to worship an emperor who deified himself. It was a matter of survival, and they were coerced and pressured with threat of death. And Pliny was whiny about it, letting Trajan know, because he's afraid of the emperor finding out that he might be out of bounds and losing control of his province. So he said, under threat of death, knowing that if he tells them, if you don't renounce this contagion, then I will have to conclude that you have some mental incapacity to reason rationally. And so he put them to death. Well, here's Trajan, who now owns the contagion. And he says, you have taken the right line, my dear Pliny, in examining of those denounced to you as Christians. For no hard and fast rule can be laid down of universal application. They are not to be sought out if they are informed against and charge is proved. They are to be punished. It says, though, if they are informed against, I mean, if someone comes as an informant and the charge is proved, they are to be punished. So he didn't want the government to go out and waste resources seeking them out. But he did say, with this reservation, that if anyone denies that he is a Christian and actually proves it, that is by worshiping our gods. Now, here's where the polytheists, plural, come into play in antagonizing these people. He shall be pardoned, and a result of his recantation, however suspect he may have been with respect to the past, pamphlets published anonymously should carry no weight in any charge whatsoever. They constitute a very bad precedent and are also out of keeping with his age. So he was progressive, but he said, though, that when you deal with these people, don't go out and seek them out. So he used the word contagion and Trajan's contagion. It's very presumptive to give a mental diagnosis of someone, and it was the precursor to what justified persecution, because after all, if they were normal, if they did not have mental derangement syndrome, then they wouldn't have had to kill them. So I found that fascinating, and in light of a last video we did when I had mentioned the Bible as evidence, since it was prepared after claims had been proclaimed, some for quite some time, and after things later had been allegedly fulfilled, because people say it's backloaded, meaning people wrote the script to fit the narratives that preceded. For example, in the New Testament, with 4 centuries between the Testaments, one of the incredulous features often attributed to subsequent texts is that, well, they were just writing it to customize it to fit the presupposed narratives. Well, that sounds good. It's just we were using math and noticing, for example, a ratio. Not that we had to eisegetically interpose it. It's staring right at our face as we were trained in the seminary. Do your own search of the scriptures, then do your own research. We collaborated with one another. I and Dr. Johnson are involved in research assisting the hermeneutics retired professor, Dr. John Penn, a Baptist historian, a legacy of promoting and provoking people to thought, think for yourself, study for yourself, and then to have a diverse background in multiple fields of study, and then apply all that you can know, and don't be afraid to study anything. So when I stated that the Bible was evidence and that I was evaluating the evidence, it caused a reaction, which is fine. It wasn't inappropriate. I don't know anyone that escalated the conversation beyond just disagreement, or there could have been some diminutive implications with some of it. I'm not sure. I was called a genius, but I don't think it was sincere, which is okay, because part of the history of the seminary is its legacy. Goes all the way back to its founding. There was a man named Dr. Benham Bogard, very controversial and very devoted man to education. But he encountered Clarence Darrow, who came to Little Rock, Arkansas, to defend Darwinism. It says Bogard criticized the secularism of the Chicago lawyer, but was unable to shake Darrow's confidence in acceptance of the theoretical work of Charles Darwin. Clay Fulk, socialist critic of the conservative order, employed ridicule to deride Bogard. Now, I think we express it as ad hominem or something like that in our critical thinking or our dialectic discourse or in our logical reasoning. So we even have a category for personal attacks. Bogard cravenly permitted the wicked one, Darrow, to come right into the fold among his flock and maybe devour some of his little ewe lambs. Brother Ben, you cannot hope to escape the consequences of your pusillanimous, you'll have to read that in the notes, negligence. It's a longer word for cowardly or shrinks away. By hiding behind the times, God probably sent the org Darrow down to Little Rock just to try your faith. Then you had your opportunity, but instead of rising to it nobly as Calvin rose to his when God sent Servetus, I think I mispronounced both times, to Geneva, you cowered in the background and failed ignominiously. Now you whine about the time. So apparently that writer was waxing very loquacious. But anyway, that was very interesting history. Also, to go back or go even further, you'll notice that the Arkansas voters actually defied their state senators and passed the Anti-Evolution Act. So Arkansas, you notice, and the Baptists, particularly in Arkansas, the oldest Bible school, the seminary in Arkansas. And you just say the seminary because it's exclusive Bible. The professors are actually pastors. It's just something that's quite unique in its scholarship and in its it's very difficult to suppose the arduous demands on those who would work in such a pastor-professor function when that is obviously beyond. Either one would be enough for one man to bear, much more both. But it says that by a 2-to-1 margin, and that's enough there. But I'll have the link. These are several pages, and you can read about it. I have some more here, but as someone who's a curator of a Lamp Theological Institute, it's also a museum. So before I move on, I'll show you some of the items that we have in it. Here's a book about Benham Bogard. Now I keep these have to go back to the vault. This is a volume 1 book. It's very unusual to find one of this quality. This one's never been read. Now I don't know where to find another one, but this one's kept in the vault. But really fascinating is a recent book, Benham Bogard. It was written by a person from Baylor University. I just had this received. It's now in the Institute, and it'll be documented and placed on file and archived. The Father of Modern Landmarkism, and it has a synopsis on the back. Of course, I've not read this one. It's just arrived, and it was interesting to me to find that it was more than a few times out of stock. And I would go online and thought, why in the world, who would be ordering a book about the Father of Modern Landmarkism? But apparently his notoriety is still there, and the history and legacy. But here's a book by Dr. Bogard, and he says, Bible proved by science. He has a Bachelor of Science, and here's a debate about evolution. if you want to see that, if you can. But it's fascinating. This was by William Jennings Bryan, and it's Logical, Humoring, Convincing Answers to Evolution. Now, I haven't read these. These would actually, this spine is very old, and you can see even the staples are rusted. So, but that's a fascinating thing, and that's why it's perhaps sometimes perceived incorrectly when an educational approach is taken, especially in apologetics, because that's why we teach, and I am studying and researching still a lifetime of early educators in Arkansas. I have reel-to-reel players that were actually used to record seminary lectures by professors, hundreds of the old tapes that are I try to listen to some to see what can be captured and continue to be placed online. So that's quite an effort to carry on that legacy of unprecedented initiative for education. Now, you can read all you want about Dr. Benham Bogard. He's an open book. Read the Encyclopedia of Arkansas, go to Wikipedia, whatever you want to do, it's all out there. And so I'll put the links I have. But to have a reaction, as we noticed recently and throughout in studying, it's really uncharacteristic of academics, but to know Dawkins Delusion is a term being used, and delusion can be considered a mental malady, and you could have a diagnosis. Of course, I'm not sure who would actually achieve that diagnosis and participate. For example, in Arkansas, the Baptist Medical System, Catholic Health Initiative. Of course, it's interesting, those two hospitals are the dominant systems in this state. They have the longer history, if you will, and even some unpleasant encounters throughout history. We don't see the atheistic medical system. That's certainly because atheists, as we know it today, this neo form of atheism seems to have emerged from those who were Christians or from a culture of Christianity. So before I move on, this idea of Baptists, some quotes about Baptists. Also, Bogard defended an atheist's right to speak because of the freedom of speech that Baptists advocate. And here's some quotes from Baptists. I'll put this link in the description. But as enforced uniformity of religion throughout a nation or civil state confounds the civil and religious, it denies the principles of Christianity and civility, and that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh. That's by Roger Williams, founder of the First Baptist Church in America, the bloody tenet of persecution for cause of conscience. And of course, Baptists were notorious for opposing state interference with the freedom of religion. And that's why in our nation, you'll hear people say, oh, there's 30,000 different denominational expressions of faith or practice. Okay. And so it's ironic that people who are under the category Baptist, which was an accusation, which comes from the Greek word categoria. It was done because they preached the gospel and baptized those who believed it without a license. Well, why would we have a license if from a state-established religion we would refuse their authority? Primarily because we wouldn't recognize it. And secondly, because we wouldn't need it to preach the gospel and baptize those who believe it. In 1773, it says, religious matters are to be separated from the jurisdiction of the state, not because they're beneath the interest of the state, but quite to the contrary, because they are too high and holy, and thus are beyond the competence of the state. Now, we know the difficulties in the state, high turnover rate, populist, a person who's just popular now might be in office and things like that. But it says God has appointed two kinds of government in the world, which are distinct in their nature and ought never to be confounded together, one of which is called civil, and the other is ecclesiastical. This was Isaac Backus, colonial Baptist from New England, appeal to the public for religious liberty. And Thomas Jefferson actually defended Baptists in the colonies when they were arrested for preaching. Now, we might laugh today and think, who in the world would arrest someone for preaching the gospel, especially a polytheistic person, because they have such a multivariate perspective. They seem to be so open-minded as to invite multiple deities. And certainly what academic person of an educated background background, any scholarship at all would take issue with someone preaching the gospel and baptizing those who believe it, and that group covenant together for the purpose to live with the interest of one another, not to the diminished return of each other's engagement, but rather the building them up, to recognize a man who wants to be responsible for a wife and those parents who want to raise their children, nurture and admonition of the Lord. So no one rationally would oppose it because they couldn't find a cause against it, as Pliny, who was whiny about it, had Trajan triggered, and if it hadn't been for their polytheistic economy that was threatened, as Timothy, a young pastor that Paul had called a genuine son in the faith, had found himself at odds with the silversmiths over the temple Diana, and he had become so effectual in confronting the futility of merchandising people by selling them these vain trinkets and this dead worship rituals that were nothing more than exploiting these people. He was actually martyred because of interfering with that practice. So back to the ratio for a moment. And I was noticing how many people were thinking it was numerology. That's a pejorative term. It just means someone was trying to say something to belittle it. And you can actually see it. It doesn't mean you want to. We're all blind spotted, and atheists, polytheists, and even Baptists aren't immune to it. But this is elementary algebra. I had never taken this course, and I was in a Calculus 3 class, taking it for the second time, studying after Leibniz, studying it as theology. And I took Calculus 2 twice, Cal 1 twice, trigonometry 3 times, college algebra 3 times, discrete math, statistics. No, I don't mean I took it and used it in application in fields of engineering or architecture or whatever else those things might call for. I was studying it as theology. And I learned, however, that there were some little things that I had never quite acquired that proved to be quite useful. And we were taught in the seminary to be careful about studying. Dr. Penn himself had taught us even every single letter, for example, in biblical Hebrew has implication and significance. And now that means every letter is numeric, pictographic, and phonetic. So if you're not dealing with the word and the sound and its etymology and root meaning, you're dealing with the paleo-pictographic implication of what's it communicating in pictograph, or now you're noticing the arrangement in its numeric values, which were assigned to those letters long before the people began to compose it. So we hear about intelligent design, we hear about fine-tuning, and even some honest atheists who are academic in their presentation will recognize that fine-tuning, I suppose is a phrase, or intelligent design might be something that warrants their interest. A graduate MIT professor said, of course, the laws that govern material matter presupposes that matter. So he was having no problem with God existing before the things that the laws that they can observe. Now, he would not assign perhaps all the multivariate distinctions and attributes. However, you couldn't refute his science. Scientists have come out and noticed several things. And one thing, just to show the ratio for a moment, all we did as the Koine Project Class, as we were trained in the seminary, is to bring in all the data, have a holistic perspective. And you recall that we had heard the dispute was between 6 and 20,000 years. That was asserted, and somebody had invented this category. A great scholar, Bible scholar, had noticed that why did we go along with a new word? And of course, that's another discussion. But we had talked about it. Dr. Penn said there was a formula in the Bible, and of course, under his guidance, research assistance, and willingness to collaborate, Eddie and I began to work. Eddie Johnson, that is, a seminary graduate and laborer in the field. So we noticed there was a difference of 14,000. And that was just how you began to approach a problem. So we started at the lowest number, 6,000, and would go in, if you will, we would just start closing the window by thousands. And then we would start doing that at 250 year increments. So again, as we notice, and I will, without doing a third grade arithmetic lesson, but we'll tell you that you should have expected from Arkansas, even if you spell it Arkinsaw, Arkansas, you should have expected that independent researchers and people who labored in word and doctrine, and for example, a Dr. John Penn, who knew and interacted with the three founders of the oldest seminary, oldest Bible school in the state of Arkansas, should have expected people that had been encouraged and provoked to stand and speak boldly on behalf of freedom of conscience, thought, and speech, and whose history showed a demonstrable aversion toward the imposition against a person's conscience, thought, and speech by a state-established religion, who would have the primary interest in doing so by deploying the, let's say, military and police to enforce their dogma. So Baptists should be quite admired for that, as I come to admire them, because of just noticing that they, by not being state established, were free to accompany the Cherokee on a trail of tears, and certainly had the empathy. So we started at 6,250 years, very simple. And then Jesus said 12 hours in a day, so 12-hour day, 12 hours per day. That's a ratio. And then so we then went down and said, okay, since Dr. Penn pointed out 12 hours a day, we needed our 12 hours a night. And of course, you're free to study. You're free to go through, like Dr. Robinson told us, evaluate everything, look at it, question it, call it into question. So you wouldn't find yourself attending very many seminaries where you were encouraged to do your own work and to not be afraid of any of your conclusions. So I've never known what that would mean anyway. I wouldn't have wasted my time having to be coerced against my freedom of conscience and thought to research. I would certainly never have had wasted my time to have a canned presentation. So now we have 12,500 years at 24 hours. And you remember the one day, and I'll just go slow here, but one day is 1,000 years. So there's one day. Well, here, I'll just show this. One day is 1,000 years. And then, of course, the inverse or reciprocal is 1,000 years as one day. Now, there's really not a rational being that would say that's not a ratio. They certainly wouldn't, unless they were ignorant of third grade arithmetic, and they really wouldn't be watching the video. But you could just, we know to write this one day over 1,000 years. And then here's 1,000 years, one day. We know if we multiplied it, we would just come up with 1. So that's what a multiplicative inverse does. It solves for 1. So here we have this, and this is already written. You couldn't help but notice it, but for being blind spotted, it actually shows its own multiplicative inverse. So what we did then was just simply say, let's take the 12,500 chronological years, as you would expect people who do independent research to freely, and I've never been discouraged from studying. I was trained to do so in the seminary. 12,500 years times 360 days, and that will then find us with 4.5 million days. I can sometimes I really make that mistake. I think in the last video I put years here, but now we're going to move from the days to the years. So we just multiply now by 1,000 years, and that would equal the 4.5 billion. Now this is what I, as an educator and a trainer, do, and encourage you all to keep studying, evaluate. No one really cares that you found this. No one cares that you noticed it. No one cares, meaning they're not going to assault you. Maybe you might get a snarky comment, but that's because we're out on the World Wide Web. We're on something called YouTube. And if you knew the history of how some young collegiates at our church put me up to it, you would find it somewhat laughable to find me in a predicament that they knew I would be resilient or impervious to any of the feedback, because as a trained professional consultant, we were taught to treasure feedback. Listen to what everyone has to say. We were taught to first seek to be understand before you seek to be understood. And that was even what they taught at the seminary. So 4.5 billion, we come back this way, and we want to take the 4.5 and multiply it by days. 1,000 days is approximately 2.78 years at 360 days, and that equaled approximately 2.78. That equaled the 12.5 billion years. And this was the amount of decay, and this is the amount of decay incurred by the Earth, and this is the amount of decay in the universe. And of course, now scientists are debating dark matter, dark energy, but it's really not for us. We were asked and tasked to use parameters, research parameters that use Bible information. So that's why the answer or the assertion is so unique, because Bible parameters, as set by our hermeneutics professor, and I was his graduate assistant in the seminary, now research assistant, we just want to know, what could we know if we just use the data from the Bible? So that's what we've done. And this is where, I have not had any people who had really thought about it, who evaluated it, say anything. We've actually had academics reply, which was perfectly appropriate. We want dialogue. We encourage it. We're taught in the seminary to interact with everyone to initiate these relationships. So here it is right here. You can get the third grade arithmetic. But one thing I would just like to show you is something Bart Ehrman helped me with. He had done, if you listen carefully, the atheists can do a lot of work for you. And let's just break this down into 4 categories, or 4 core features that would get us to what we would call a confidence in the truth. So each of these will be worth 25%, because as teachers, when we give our tests, we have to fill in the blank, might be worth 1 or 2 points, and a multiple choice might be 1 point each, and fill in the blank 2 or 3, maybe 5, but an essay might be, 10 or 20 points. So let's just quantify all this. 25%. And I think it was an interview with Bart Ehrman and a Seth Andrews, who is typical of a person who comes out of Christianity and now he is advocating himself to be an atheist. Well, he was engaged in a conversation, and he said, well, Bart, and I'm not faulting him. He's not the academic. He's certainly not the scholar Bart Ehrman is. And Bart Ehrman's perhaps unsurpassed, just published volumes and volumes about the Bible and Christianity. Well, he said, we can't even prove Jesus existed. Well, Bart actually somewhat chuckled, not in a disrespectful way, but in a startled manner of saying, no, it's absolute fact. So 25% if we've got evidence that Jesus lived. So yes, we've got that. And then he said he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. So we have Jesus, we have his life, we have what we have today, Gospels, where we see. And then, of course, he was buried. And at one time, Bart Ehrman and Seth Andrews in the conversation had both come this far. Now, we've never retracted from this point the resurrection. So we have he lived, he died, and was buried, and raised on the third day. Now we have in the New Testament documents, but notice 75% of the work is already done by Bart Ehrman, because it was somewhat of a disappointment for Seth Andrews, I think's his name. And if I can find that interview on YouTube, I'll put the link there. If not, just Google it. So it was quite interesting to notice that it was disappointing, because now we have, and we know there's an account where Paul said, here's the correct message about the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus. We know that people say, well, you can't use the Bible as a credible source or as evidence, of course. And of course, we evaluate. We know that there's no way possible, not even a silly eisegetical interposition of this notion here. This isn't silly. This is actually very rational. It was written out even in English. If you use your King James Bible, you can see the ratio, you can see the reciprocal, you can see the multiplicative inverse, and we know there's already inherent within division multiplication. It's an inverse relationship, just as growth and decay rates are inversely related. So this was not surprising for anyone doing the research. It's something that we should all take note of and notice that, well, no, these people who here in Arkansas and independent researchers and pastors of churches, local churches, and professors who are pastors and professors laboring in word and doctrine, we're not out to harm, we're not out to violate the freedom of conscience, thought, and speech, and here we are. So that being said, I was just trying to scale this, because let's just take away Genesis 1:1, that numeric value equals pi when it's set in a ratio and multiplication is used. The number of letters, 28, times the product of those letters divided by the number of words, 7, multiplied by the product of those words, which that's, again, third grade arithmetic. It's the application. And we were trained in the seminary about the competing philosophies. One's pathos, emotive, can sometimes be irrational, like in pathological reasoning, and then mathological, mathos, which is the root word for disciple. Now that is what sometimes is very difficult, because if you have to engage that as a disciple and you see the reasoning as mathological, so then we would have expected to find pi in the first verse of the first chapter of the first book of the Bible. We would expected to find in paleo pictograph that the Prince of God, the Son of God, left his father's house and at the hand of violence was crucified. Moses, the alleged author, which scholars in the Bible will say he didn't write it, and then we're certainly not prepared to discuss that. We're just talking about what we can know from the Bible. So that in the first verse we have the number pi, and then we have the pictograph that whoever wrote that, according to the unknown author in certain fields of academia, still we have, referring to the Bible, we have the knowledge that pictograph already stated that the Son of God at the hand of violence would be crucified. So we move on now. And we expect the creation text in John 1:1. We shouldn't be surprised that the number E, which is E equals 2.71828. I told you before, this repeats. So you just go 1828 again. And then, of course, you have the numbers here, 40, 90, and 40, 45, 90, and 45, which that would be easy to recall a right triangle. So we have this ability to notice that we were just using integers and came up with an approximate value of E. So we're not really irrational. We're not delusional. We're doing what would be rationally expected and evaluating the text that we've been persuaded to believe before we ever studied it. And someone said, well, you believe before you had evidence. I said, I wouldn't know how to do otherwise. I know people have attended physicians and had surgeries. They have no concept of what took place. It was only in later years where people could actually see a video before their surgery of what one looks like, so they would know what they were undergoing. But I'm not sure any rational expectation would be to know the field and know something, because before Bart Ehrman became the unsurpassed Bible scholar in New Testament studies and a scholastic unsurpassed, but yet he disappointed an atheist who admits he's not the scholar, but he was wanting to have this or this called into question, but it's not. So we're already up to 75% by Bart Ehrman. I'll put his name here, Bart Ehrman. So if you don't react too quickly, you might notice that some of these people that are now atheists have really done a lot of work for you and got you really going here. You got this out of the way so you can avoid those who don't achieve the responsibility or take the responsibility for academic integrity, who would then say Jesus didn't exist, he didn't die or wasn't crucified, and he wasn't. I mean, come on, that's kind of so it's really great, and I'm very grateful that we were trained in seminary to be mathological, to respect people, our neighbors, respect those who dissent, because we're the dissenters. There's a chapel in the 15th century, Dissenters' Chapel, where we refuse to go along with state impositions. So now that we have that, and of course, I won't mention Leibniz, theologian who developed calculus, Richard Feynman, who was the famous contemporary physicist of our time. He became quite popular and well known when he investigated the 1986 Space Shuttle Challenger explosion, and he found the root cause of it. And he had quoted that calculus was the language God spoke, and without calculus we wouldn't have this cell phone. And that's one reason why I would just like to then say that, so we have calculus in our column that came from theologians. We have Newton. He was also known for chemistry, and he was also allegedly involved as a theologian developing calculus. So that's really a big one there to know that, and they wrote theological books, so it didn't seem to it never occurred to them to suggest God didn't exist, but with minds that invented, developed, discovered, noted, and recorded calculus, which I sat in 6 semesters of it and was just very impressed with the thought of it and watching how these theologians did it. Now, they didn't have a calculus textbook, and I know how much work I involved myself in. So that's a big plus there, that we have theologians who have unsurpassed minds. There's no one who today would say they've invented something like that. But then I picked up a book today just to have a contemporary, and it says Advanced Praise for Return of the God Hypothesis, a marvelous compendium of indisputable scientific evidence in support of the existence of God. Now, this is not a seminary student from Arkansas. This is not a student who struggled and labored very difficult, exerted myself to study math as a language and study it as theology. This is a person, Dr. Marcos Eberlin, professor of chemistry, Mackenzie University, Brazilian Academy of Sciences, and a Thomson medalist. And then it goes on and says, a state-of-the-art treatise on arguments and counter-arguments about intelligent design. It performs a gigaton task, of covering the origin of everything from molecular machinery to the entire universe. A much-needed book. Dr. Stuart Burgess, professor of engineering design, Bristol University, research fellow, Clare Hall University of Cambridge. With this book, Stephen Meyer. So I'm just throwing Stephen Meyer here, using him as an example here. And of course, I'll have a reference to that book, and it's an ebook, and I was gifted an Amazon gift card from one of my grandchildren. So with this book, Stephen Meyer earns a place in the pantheon of distinguished non-reductive natural philosophers of the last 120 years, from the great French savant Pierre Duhem through A.N. Whitehead to Michael Polanyi. He has written a profound, judicious book of great value, combining both advanced, detailed scientific expertise and philosophical integrative wisdom. Professor Michael D., can't pronounce his name, emeritus, Boston University, author of The Restoration. Man, it just goes on and on, these people who have endorsed it. So you can list all their names. You can take the theologians of calculus who also wrote textbooks and theological textbooks. You can now read this latest one. You can go back through history and just line up all. But the only burden we have now is a 25%. And if you incorporate the unsurpassed text, let's just say you go to Mathological Monotheism, a website. I think that's the name of it. I'll put a link to it. And you see the numeric values. How would people over a 1,500-year period of time with multiple languages, primary Greek and Hebrew, with multiple genres, and without the internet, without personal computer for just no. Anyway, and it's not that argument about, the argument has been probably, no, it's impossible over a 1,500-year period of time. It's not even saying it's it's not even a possibility that these men could have been so cogent and cognizant of what they were writing, as we could then say the writer of John 1:1 in Koine Greek. Koine Greek was assuring that as he wrote those letters out by hand, that now let's make sure we don't interfere with Genesis 1:1, let's make sure we put E here, and then let's make sure in Hebrew we result in pi. I'm certain they were doing that, and which we know that's an absurdity. Then we know that in Proverbs 3:19, as I use it's a mnemonic device, the 22 letters that were done in a previous video, we know that there was no way that someone was actually aware of this kokma, which we learned its ordinal value was 37. Its standard, the standard value, the ordinal value was 37. The standard value was 73. And you notice those are inverse. Again, third grade arithmetic. We noticed then that the 37 was the 12th prime number and 73 was the 21st prime number. So we know the author of Proverbs certainly could not, with his pencil and paper in a different time, in a different place, somehow be wirelessly connected to someone who would later. And so that's not really something to ridicule without bringing upon someone a tell, which we'd call your bias is showing, and you're now avoiding academic research and the rigors of study that would come from a rational person to evaluate a text and evaluate, for example, as I affirm and admit openly that this is my evidence that I engage, and my parameters are Bible. What can we know from the Bible? And that's why we do the research. So it looks like, since Bart Ehrman's already given us 75% before we even get started in our contention, and if we don't emote, and if we don't react, which is the most ignoble form of expression, and we listen carefully, we bring Newton and Leibniz in. We bring a Stephen Meyer in. We don't even mention Richard Feynman. We don't even mention all that we know from list of scientists. Here's a contemporary. He was recently on the Piers Morgan interview by Piers Morgan, and I believe it's millions of views now. We now have an evaluation of what's there, not what we brought into the text, but what's there. So this is a good case, and again, you should have expected it. I'll just inform you that if people had known and understood the value of education in Arkansas and Bible education, and for example, the founders of that oldest Bible school in Arkansas, even having a bachelor's level of degree, so people can enter in the lowest level of education, complete a bachelor's, now associates, and I think associates were even available sometime in the past. I don't know how far back. And then you can have a master's degree, complete a doctorate degree. You're encouraged to study, search the scriptures, research them. So that's what we do. So this is a very long video, but it's enough to let you know that when you go back and read the history of the controversies in the South, all that political and social turmoil, but notice in the core of it were people pressing forward to teach men, equip men, and so you should have expected it. When you see someone result in an observation, that it was always there. The fact that we've overlooked it, we all know, because as I, and trained by those in the seminary, was taught, we can all be blind spotted, and we're to recognize, first of all, as Dr. Penn likes to say, approach a text assuming you're wrong. Well, that's a degree of concession that we don't often want to make. So anyway, that's enough, but it's an easy case to make when people, I can't even pronounce their names, and such scholars and listed in the book that I will put the link to it, and just told you, written by Stephen Meyer, these scholars in all these different fields saying it was indisputable evidence. Okay, they said it. They say what they have is evidence. I'm saying we are biblicists, and we work through the text, and we can demonstrate that those people had knowledge of something that we, if we're not careful in the West, might have a arrogance about us, myself included, where we suppose that what we know today by the technology we have could not have been known by those who went before us. Well, that would not be indicative of scholarship and research, which often shows us the opposite. Even in medicine, there's research into ancient methods and things that were lost that people research now and should research, because there are things out there that are there to be learned and relearned that were once known by some and others who went before. So you have a blessed day and enjoy this lesson.